This is Chapter 8, Institutions, from Gender, Ideas, Interactions, Institutions. So the context. Ideas of gender shape the environment in which we live, right? They're an organizing principle of our society. So they affect the way that we understand and interpret the world. So we cannot simply reject the binary and policing because these are factors outside of our control. Gender and gender inequality are part of the fabric of our lives, and they're intertwined between our lives largely because of the way that they're embedded within the social institutions we're going to discuss in this lecture. So when you look at the organization of everyday life, there's a lot of social institutions that we encounter, and we kind of take them for granted, but each social institution gives us roles and identities and expectations for how we'll behave, or kind of, again, these things regulate and control a lot of aspects of society. So one example is American education as an institution. It's what sociologists call an institution because it has a persistent pattern of social interaction that's aimed at meeting the needs of society that can't be easily met by individuals. So this is why we rely on institutions to do some of this work for us. So what makes education an institution? Well, education is an example of an institution because we support it collectively, creating a systematic way to achieve a goal of having an educated citizenry. So whether it's education, whether it's, the government, whether it's the criminal justice system, whether it's, any of these social institutions we come in contact with, the economy, right? The control of institutions is what's really important and really what sociologists look at. So the institution of education itself is carefully organized and controlled. So it really dictates the when, where, and how of teaching. So the institution of education also involves organizations. So you have primary and secondary school, colleges, universities, as well as federal and state departments of education. You have private schools and even companies, that come along to try to help parents with homework, with proms, with graduation. But for the most part, these organizations and routines are taken for granted as just like that's what school is, right? But we don't think about just how, large of a social structure this is that organizes and manages a lot of data, but also gives us a lot of expectations. And again, gender is built into the understandings and organizations themselves. So this largely, affects the way that we then encounter the world and what opportunities we have. So some of the definitions from the chapter: norms, which are just beliefs and practices that are well known or widely followed. So we call it norms because, the word normal, things that we just kind of take for granted as normal, those are norms. And then policies are explicit and codified expectations that have stated consequences if you are deviant or violate those expectations. So like rules related to fighting. So norms and policies actually can work together and reinforce each other. So some norms and policies are strongly enforced, while others are really enforced only weakly. So it's difficult for us to get cultural ideas that we don't want out of our brains because we're being inundated with them through messages, through roles, through all of these kind of policies that we encounter from social institutions. We can surround ourselves with people who support our choices and accept whatever consequences come with violating the rules, but it's essentially impossible to avoid social institutions. And in so many ways, institutions impose themselves on our lives. Social structure itself is the entire set of interlocked institutions within which we live our lives. So if you think about all the things that we kind of take for granted because of the way the institutions institute certain policies that we follow, and that's just kind of what we live our lives around. Like the book example was summer vacations, which is not something that happens around the world in most countries, largely because it's connected to really wealthy people so that they can go on vacations. It's kind of interesting. It used to be, is kind of, people tend to think that it comes from rural areas where, students had to be out of school to work on the farm or whatever. But actually, it's much more so that wealthy students can travel, and really because it's crazy hot during the summer. So trying to accommodate putting a bunch of people in a classroom can be difficult, right? So that's kind of why we have a summer vacation. And we just think that's normal, though it creates all sorts of aptitude and understanding gaps, especially between those who are poor and those who have wealth, because, wealthy kids can get tutors and have access to books and all sorts of resources, while poor kids often don't have those same resources, right? If you're worried about paying the rent, you're not going to be able to buy a bunch of books and extra, training manuals and pay for a tutor or any of these kind of things. So having a couple months of not doing school can be really detrimental. But why do we do it? Because it's normal. It's just normal to us, right? It's become a norm. So our social institutions are just social inventions. They're very persuasive and persistent in our lives, so it seems like they're just a non-negotiable thing, like that's what they are and we just have to live with them. So we can't just be an individual because we're part of a society that has so many of these institutions. And again, we call it a social structure because the institutions all collectively work together to create a kind of scaffolding for our lives. So when we look at social structure, we look at the stability of institutions and their frameworks. So the stability of institutions and the relationships between them provide a framework that helps us make rational decisions for, the kind of rules and policies that we have in our culture. So structures are helpful because they help us know what we want to accomplish and how to accomplish it. But institutions can both enable us, but also constrain our lives, right? Because there's no opting out. We live in and through and with institutions, and these shape our opportunities and our lives. So institutions are very gendered. Education, again, as that example, is an example of a gendered institution because education is gendered many ways. Like in elementary school, how do you address your teacher? It's Mr. So-and-so or Miss So-and-so or Mrs. So-and-so, right? It's not like when you get to the collegiate level, it's Professor, whatever their last name is, right? But again, in elementary school, it's very Mr. this, Miss that, Mrs. that. And so it really focuses on the kind of gender of the teacher themselves as the kind of moniker for how you even address them. Not to mention the fact that it's very typical in schools to separate kids by gender, to kind of, dualistic gender understandings, right? Boys over here, girls over there. And so that's just a couple examples of so many ways in which education itself is a gendered institution. It gives us different policies and expectations for our behaviors and different opportunity structures depending on our genders. So a gendered institution itself is just one that has gender as an organizing principle, right? It's like a lens you look through to understand people within that institution. So in a gendered institution, men and women are channeled into different and often differently valued or, different social spaces, different activities, and their choices have different and often unequal consequences. So gender salience is the relevance of gender across contexts, across activities and spaces. So, these different parts of the institutional landscape where gender might mean more or less. So American elementary school playgrounds feature kind of geography of gender, where girls tend to play one set of games and boys tend to play in a separate part of the playground, different kinds of games. But the importance of gender fades when students return to the classroom, where they're rarely segregated by gender, but are arranged in other ways that are conducive to an orderly classroom. So in education, as well as other institutions, the salience of gender varies even throughout the day while you're in school. Okay, so let's move on to the institutionalization of gender differences. When you institutionalize gender differences, you affirm and enforce both gender differences and inequality itself. So gender institutions matter. One intimate example is our plumbing, right? Since people cannot build and maintain a personal toilet in every location they go to, providing a safe and sanitary way to eliminate personal waste is a public service that's necessary. But public bathrooms themselves are very gendered institutions. So gendered institutions are very interesting from a sociological point of view because they affirm and enforce gender difference and inequality. So we typically find men's and women's bathrooms in separate locations, which requires you to pick one. And again, a lot of this is an interesting history to this, right? That U.S. sanitation policies require public bathroom facilities in workplaces, schools, restaurants, and government buildings, to have options, gendered options. So the Department of Labor reported in 1913 that a woman's body is unable to withstand strains, fatigues, and deprivations, as well as a man's. So obviously that ideology affected the kind of earliest construction of women's bathrooms in public spaces. So restrooms were, small private rooms, but they also, the women's bathrooms had a bed or chair that, if you're a woman and you just had to like, oh, I fainted, you had like your fainting couch to lay on. And that's why they called them restrooms. It was a place you could go and rest in other people's farts, I guess. Right? But again, it's interesting that introduction of the restroom reinforced the idea that women were fragile and weak compared to men, and that they needed to like go lay down on a couch or something, which in turn justified paying them less, having less policies that actually address their needs, right? Because they're weak. They're not as important. So sex segregated bathrooms are really interesting. It became, especially in the Victorian era, this helped women conceal bodily functions that allowed men to pretend that women don't go to the bathroom. We still have this weird thing where if women menstruate, it upsets men, or if women, digest food and then have waste, that upsets men, as if women, like, they put the food in, it comes out somewhere, right? So it's interesting how this ideology that women should be shamed when it comes to just regular biological functions kind of comes out of this separateness of a bathroom necessity, right? So it's really interesting. When you think about it, how many of you have a gender segregated bathroom at home? You probably just have that one bathroom, right? The one that like everybody uses. So this kind of gender segregation understanding of bathrooms really comes from the outside world, the public sphere. And again, in the Victorian era, they had this idea of separate spheres, that women were supposed to stay inside the home and men were supposed to be outside the home. So you had the kind of, separate spheres. So it makes sense that, again, reinforcing gender inequality in the policies that were put forth by these social institutions. So when you look at gender in bathrooms today, sex segregation of toilet facilities has become a very powerful norm, and it's being increasingly contested because of issues of, trans visibility and people not being able to, there's all these bills that are popping up where the government is trying to say who can use what bathroom, right? So again, it's sex segregated bathrooms serve a social, not a biological function, right? Because when you go to the bathroom, you're all just going to the bathroom. That's really what that is. That means I'm sure any of you that have, that are listening to my voice have at some point gone into a bathroom that wasn't for your gender identity because it was like the one with no line and like you survived. You know what I mean? Because it's a toilet, right? It's pretty much the same thing. So today, in every state in the U.S., this requires separate bathrooms for men and women in public buildings and private businesses. So the example of sex-segregated bathrooms just shows us how institutions can be gendered, as well as the intersection of gender with other identities can be politicized. So policies can enforce ideas about gender and be both introduced and changed when there's political and public will. So sex segregations of bathrooms gives women a sex-segregated space in which to do body work that's expected to remain invisible to men, right? Powder your nose, right? Again, I've never powdered my nose, but that idea of, going to a place to like reapply your makeup, let out all the farts you've been holding, right? All of these kind of things. Because again, the idea is that women are supposed to just kind of be decorative objects that just like look great all the time. But unless you can constantly check your makeup and hair and all these things, the standard that women are being judged against is a perfection that we see through television and film, that often they only have 3-minute clips and then they cut and then someone runs in and fixes their makeup or fixes their hair. It's an unreasonable standard for human normal people to live up to, but that's kind of what it is. And so part of this illusion leaves it for men to, like, somehow it's bad if a woman actually applies her makeup in front of you or, has to get ready or something like that. Because again, it's revealing this invisible body work that's just kind of expected for women to do somewhere, somehow. And of course, this is especially true when it comes to actually using the bathroom itself, right? This weird idea that women don't go to the bathroom, which is just like, no, that's not, like anything that eats also craps. So, right? Or like the famous book, Everybody Poops, right? So, sex-segregated bathrooms just uphold gender binaries. By providing different bathrooms, we assume that everyone needs to protect their private parts from the other sex, but not from the same sex. And again, it creates these kind of social notions. So bathrooms are designed without same-sex desire in mind. And since we consider that bathrooms are not only separate, separating men from women, but they're actually designed with the expectation that male-bodied people will expose their penises to one another, or that female-bodied people can do some of this body work that could be very embarrassing in front of men in these kind of confined spaces. So the real issue, though, too, is that when you segregate bathroom by sex-segregated bathrooms are not allowing for people who are gender non-conforming, people who are non-binary, people who are ambiguous, or maybe in the process of a transition. So this leads into this politics of bathrooms, which has increasingly become a topic for public debate. So 19 states have passed laws that have protected trans people's rights to use the bathroom of their choice in any public place, while many other states, mostly in the South, have passed or considered passing bills that restrict bathroom rights, largely based on the claim that allowing trans people to access women's bathroom is dangerous. Again, not dangerous for the trans people, but the assumption is it's dangerous for cisgendered women or children, which again, there's no documented proof for in any way. In the 19 states that have passed laws protecting trans people's right to use the bathroom of their choice, you have 0 cases of a trans woman hurting a woman in a bathroom. But forcing that trans woman to go into the bathroom with men does open her up for violence. By not allowing people to use the bathroom of their choice, it's literally the government dictating someone's rights and opportunities over their own body. And again, the real thing that got me on this, I remember when these bills first started being promoted to exclude people from getting to use the bathroom of their choice, is how do you enforce that? You're just going to put cops at every bathroom door and they're going to check everyone's genitals? Because remember, we don't read people as male-bodied or female-bodied based on their actual genitals. We read it based on their performance of gender, right? What does their hair look like? Do they have facial hair? Are they wearing makeup? What are they dressed like? What clothes are they dressed in? That's how we read gender. We don't read it by genitals. So this whole idea of trying to reinforce a biological notion of gender, saying that the sex you were assigned at birth is your gender, it's just not how that works, right? So obviously, this has a lot more to do with trying to institutionalize discrimination more so than to actually protect anyone from being harmed, because who's actually being put at risk are trans people themselves. So policies can enforce ideas about gender, but can also change when there's public or political pressure to do something about it. So the politics of bathroom use has become increasingly a topic for public debate. So currently, U.S. federal law makes it illegal for employers to force trans employees to use the bathroom that corresponds to their assigned sex at birth and not their gender identity. But this doesn't often offer trans students the same protections. In some states, these laws have been passed so that students themselves don't have to worry about that, but in other states, that's not the case. And this causes a lot of psychological and emotional burdens to put on people, especially because just using a bathroom should just be kind of matter of fact. And instead, there's apps that exist so that trans people can find bathrooms that they can use without the fear of recrimination or being attacked. So when it comes to gender ambiguity in bathrooms, people who are ambiguous in some way or non-conforming may have difficulty in using, whatever's considered the correct bathroom. So eliminating sex-segregated bathrooms or requiring, the provision of more gender-neutral ones are policies that help non-binary people, but they also help cis people too. So trans, genderqueer, fluid, or ambiguous appearing individuals can be inconvenienced by sex-segregated bathrooms, but the binary approach to bathrooms causes everyone problems from time to time. People who are gender ambiguous or non-binary may also face gender policing when using the bathroom. Sociologist Betsy LaCall employs strategies to navigate this difficulty. She will try to rearrange her clothing to make her breasts more obvious, or she tries to go with a woman, who is helpful because it can legitimize her presence within that space. So this becomes an extra burden, a problematic thing to deal with every day, every time you're in public, like an additional barrier for people based on their gender presentation. So moving on to sports. Sports are a big part of an institution that shapes our experiences. You have schools, parks, community organizations, the media. All of these institutions bring sports into our lives. The entire economy benefits from the institutions of sports, which can be a $500 billion industry. But sports are often very institutionalized and very strongly gendered. Sports not just are strongly gendered, but they establish a hierarchy among men and demonstrate women's supposed inferiority. So vast numbers of individuals and organizations profit from and are all invested in this industry. Once American children start school, they might be required to take physical education that teaches certain sports and not others. Schools are also sites where team play and competition are taught and encouraged. And again, sports establish a hierarchy that the attempt is to separate the men from the boys. So one of the first recreational physical activities that was taken up by women ever was bicycling. And bicycling changed women's lives because it gave them mobility and some measure of freedom. While sports are a part of a boy's basic manhood training, most boys are encouraged to participate in sports at some level, this really isn't the case for women. In the early days, this one's fascinating. Doctors actively discouraged women from bicycling because they were told that it would be like it was too much exertion. Bicycling would cause bicycle face. Whatever the hell that is, right? Nevertheless, they still rode bikes. And if you think about the kind of amazing female athletes we have today, it's interesting when we celebrate their accomplishments, we still celebrate them being masculine. We masculinize them instead of realizing, well, they're literally women, right? That are doing these things. But if you make muscles equate to masculinity instead of muscles equate to bodies, then you kind of strip women of their achievements and kind of still fall in line with the androcentrism of society. So sports has a lot to do with masculinity. It's not just about individual accomplishment, it's also about competition, being better than someone, beating them. You know, the key to that acceptance is being at the top of the hierarchy. So sociologist Michael Messner argues that sports serve partially to socialize boys and young men to hierarchies, to being competitive, and to being aggressive. So while some men will excel at this, others fail, and the hierarchy is constructed. So sports, especially the most masculinized sports, is one way that society affirms the value of masculinity. So one example of this is picking teams, right? This can be a very formative experience of hierarchy when you're a child, one that's somewhat traumatic when you're the person who's picked last, right? It can be exhilarating when you're the person that's picked first, but if you're picked last, it's like, all of that kind of loss of status and masculinity, it just shows you're at the lowest end of that hierarchy. But sports can also be a site for bonding, right? Via this hegemonic man, even the most unimpressive couch potato can become part of the sport, right? They're just sitting there watching someone else be athletic, but it's because they're wearing their lucky socks that team won, right? So people get to sometimes share this athletic performance with themselves, even though they're just sitting on ass watching TV. It's a culture-wide feel-good male bonding extravaganza. And so this becomes a very competitive aspect because fans are going to look at hierarchies or dominance over each other. Who's leading the league, who's going to be in the playoffs, that kind of stuff. So this is used to further distance women from that dominance. So men who are interested in sports can often suffer a lot of the same disadvantages as men who just don't play them well. So one male fan said, "Oh, a woman can do the same job as me, or even be my boss, but damned if she can go on the football field and take a hit." So this idea, it's like reinforcing this idea that, like a sport like football, for example, kind of serves as a cultural testament to the idea that no matter what else happens, men are men and women are women, right? And that men are physically more capable. So when you look at how, most Americans are going to agree that men are naturally better athletes, again, this idea of biological propensities. However, our culture does not acknowledge that most athletic activities where women excel in sports, so we tend to kind of minimize the contributions of women, especially when it comes to media coverage. So Messner argues that most of popular culture in America really focuses on the most extreme possibilities in the male body and kind of focuses on athletes that have that androcentric kind of frame. So, versus sports that are more attuned to women or that are dominated by women are often considered inferior sports, right? So one of the examples in the book was rhythm gymnastics, right? It's athletic. You have to be strong, you have to have skills, but it's not considered prized or well rewarded because, again, it's considered very feminine, right? So Jane English herself proposed this thought experiment. Imagine a world where women had been historically dominant sex. Competitions emphasizing flexibility, balance, strength, and timing, and small size might dominate Sunday afternoon television instead of what does today. So at face value, football, basketball, other sports like this that rely more on physical activity or brute force, but even lineman blocking for a quarterback has to rely on timing or flexibility and speed. So why do we focus then on the force and the strength alone instead of the other things that actually, when you look at it, there's not that much, when it comes to qualities that separates football from gymnastics, but it's the idea that, and it's actually really interesting, you often see this where professional athletes will take like ballet to improve their football game. And that makes sense because, again, it's a lot of strength, agility, but we consider ballet to be such a feminine pursuit when you have to be incredibly strong to do those things. So a lot of these ideas just have to do with our ideation that men are better, that men are stronger, and that women are fragile and weak. So when we look at gender segregation in sports, right, we see that oftentimes even the bodies of professional athletes that are female are used to represent masculinity in some ways, like their muscularity is then just kind of seen as masculine. So the symbolic link between male spectators and male athletes establishes this idea that women are just not as capable, and if there are women that are strong, that they're kind of an anomaly, right? They're rare and somehow not the norm. So we have this assumption that women are lesser athletes, and that, again, the institution of sport really reinforces this for us. But most team sports have sex-segregated teams, sex-segregated leagues, and just the games are completely separate. So this ensures that men and women never compete with each other. So some people would say, oh, that's because men would beat women. But is that really true? Right? Sex-segregated teams tend to actually be supported by folks that think that women are weaker than men, right? But we can't know, right? Because you're not challenging that notion. Like, if you put women in these same sports, instead of like the WNBA and the NBA, you just make it one league, you will see women rise to the top of that hierarchy, and you will see them competing at the same level as these professional men, and that then challenges our assumptions about this segregation. So it's really interesting when we talk about sports is such a great example of this. So let's continue with sports. So oftentimes, even when you're playing the same sport, you're playing it different ways. So like let's say golf, you're doing pretty much the same thing, but you're starting from a different spot, right? Or, baseball v softball, right? You're using a different kind of ball. So what this really does is differentiate it enough so that women are always doing a lesser version of the sport, right? So again, tackle football versus flag football, or again, softball versus baseball. And there's often aesthetic expectations that are very different, meaning women have to be like adorable and decorative, and men get to actually wear clothes. So my favorite example of that is the Olympics. Like, look at the beach volleyball competitions for men and women. Men are wearing like shorts, like board shorts and a t-shirt or a tank top. And women are wearing like the teeniest sports bra and the teeniest bikini bottoms, right? Where they basically have to keep pulling them out of the crack of their ass the whole time, like every time they reset. Why? For the audience. Why? Because you might actually mistake the athleticism of the women for the men, right? Why not put everybody in board shorts and a tank top, right? Why does it have to be so gendered? But this is very common when it comes to sports, right? Like tennis, right? Women have to wear little skirts, and there's just all these kind of ways to differentiate and minimize women within these spaces, even when they're being amazing and talented, right? So you have your athleticism, but you also have to make yourself look feminine. So again, kind of going back to that feminine apologetic that we talked about before. Like, you're being masculine by performing these sports. So that means like your hair's got to look cute, you got to put a little bow in your hair, like dress, and these kind of again, the jerseys or the outfits for different sports competitions that are incredibly gendered. It's interesting too when we talk about this idea of being different but equal. So in bodybuilding competitions, rules constrain how muscular a woman can be, versus that is not the case for men, right? And so for women who are very muscular, they're expected to have long hair, super heavy makeup, or like wear like super sparkly bikinis to help use that as a feminine apologetic for being in a male space but actually performing a very masculine performance. But think about it, bodybuilding is such an interesting phenomenon because you have where the whole goal is to be as ripped as possible. But for women, if you achieve that, you're failing at being a woman. But if you succeed at being a woman, you're not going to win the bodybuilding competition. So it puts people that are female bodybuilders in this really weird bind, right? That judges are instructed to evaluate men on how muscular they are, but also, but in a different way to judge women on their muscular development and their femininity. Like how well are they balancing how buff they are with how feminine they are. So that kind of example bodybuilding shows that separating women and men allows us to require that athletic performances can conform to our gendered expectations. So, who loses when women and men compete? Well, sex segregation in sports protects a belief in our hierarchical gender binary. So basically, if you ensure that men and women never compete against each other, then we can keep having the assumption that men will always outperform women, and that goes untested. But if we integrated sports, this would be put to the test repeatedly. So this would be an opportunity to kind of challenge that. And again, this is why I put here on the slide Billie Jean King, very famous for I think they called it the Battle of the Century or Battle of the, I can't remember. I should remember that, but I'm not caffeinated enough right now. But anyway, basically there was this male tennis star going around bragging that he could beat any woman. And so Billie Jean was like, gotcha, I'll take that bet. And she whooped him, right? Like every set in the match, she took it. And if you ever watch any videos from it, it's amazing. You can see the videos on YouTube. She like comes out on like one of those like thrones you would carry like Cleopatra on, with like these strong men carrying her to the match. I mean, it was very over the top and very crazy, but it was also in the 70s, in a time period when women were breaking ground and challenging these binaries expectations, and also getting a lot of pushback from it. So this kind of battle of the century was really integral to kind of showing, women can be very athletic and talented as well, and can compete toe to toe with men. So again, gender competition, it protects boys and men from this idea that they could lose to a girl. Okay, like for example, there was this example in the book where the mother of a wrestler put it this way, quote, "It's unfair for girls to compete with boys because it puts boys in a no-win situation. If he wins, oh, it's just a girl. If he loses, his life is over." So again, that kind of interesting idea, his life is over, it just shows that it's extra humiliating to lose to a girl because we've already decided that women should lose. So, and again, why? Because it goes against our hierarchy of society, this idea that men are above women, and this androcentric nature that anything masculine is going to be better than anything feminine. So gender is neither a necessary nor logical way to organize sports, right? To make competitions fair. You could just do it kind of like, professional, amateur, whatever, as we do with other levels. So other criterion could be used, like height. You could have, a basketball league for short people. That'd be kind of fun for all those short folks that could never make it into the NBA, right? Or you can do things based on weight class or different athletic ability. But we don't, right? We do these things, we sort everybody and use gender as a way to do this. So another interesting tidbit would be the history of the Boston Marathon, where there's this woman, she was the first woman to run the Boston Marathon. She basically signed up where women weren't allowed to run it at that time because it was considered, women weren't capable of doing it. So she just signed up with the first initial of her name and her last name. And it's pretty wild. Again, all the footage is on YouTube. It's amazing. But basically, there's this moment where the guy who organized the marathon, he's kind of driving through on his little float, and he sees this woman, and he gets so mad that he jumps off the float and tries to rip the number off of her chest. And he's screaming at her, cursing at her, telling her how she doesn't belong in the race. And her boyfriend at the time, this like ex-All-American football player, just goes boom and bumps his ass off of the course, and they kept running, and she made it. She finished the marathon. And it was almost, I think it was almost 50 years later that, like, I think it was either the 50th or 51st, year after that same marathon that a woman won the Boston Marathon. So again, this idea that, of course, men are just naturally better at sports. It's like, well, when you don't let women play sports, they can't develop those skills. In the same way, if you say, oh, women are just better at emotions. Well, if you don't let men express emotions, they're not going to be good at them. So it's the same thing. As we've opened up more opportunities in education, in sports, and other facets of society for women to achieve things, we can see people like, Serena Williams, who's just like the GOAT and is amazing, right? But we still have this idea that, well, there's men and there's women, and women are inferior. So when you legally restrict someone, or just make sure that they don't get funding for their programs, or that their, again, gender segregated sport has less appeal, then you kind of aren't competing on the same ground, right? Another example could be the U.S. women's soccer team, which is just known for being amazing, versus the U.S. men's soccer team, not so much. They never place, they're not in the World Cup, it's hard to root for them. The women are incredible, the women's team. But what's interesting is when they won the World Cup and got a bunch of kind of fame from it in recent years, what came to light was the fact of just how much pay inequity there was for these female athletes, meaning they made less money when they won than the men made when they lost. So like, X amount of thousands of dollars per game, basically the men would make that much money when they lost a game. And the women would make half of that when they won a game. And when they didn't win a game, almost nothing. So you have these amazing stellar athletes out there, and the viewership of that World Cup was so much higher than a lot of the World Cups for men. So it showed, the fans want to see good soccer. It doesn't really matter to them if it's men or women. They want to watch a good team from the States. So, we have to kind of reconceptualize this. And if they're competing at the same level, they should be paid at the same level. And that's still an ongoing kind of controversial thing in our society right now. All right, looking at institutional inertia and change. So we can either change the institutions or ignore them, right, as we confront them and challenge them. So as individuals, we could wish to change them, but it's very difficult with institutions because, again, they're built over time. They have so many social ideas inside of them, and we have so many social interactions with these social institutions. So they're very resistant to change and very difficult to ignore. So we can do things differently. It just can be challenging, but it can be done. Because institutional patterns reflect widespread norms, they're often encoded in formal policies. So when you change an institution, it can be actually a lot harder to do so than you'd think, because, even the changes that take place, you change one policy, it has a ripple effect, but those changes can take time. So doing things differently can be challenging on multiple fronts. It isn't to say that institutions can't be changed. We've already changed a lot of these institutions over time. But changing them also requires a collective shift in norms and routines, and that can be harder to do, right? One example is Title IX. This was a change that was the result of collective work of activists and politicians. So the kind of work that went into this passed Title IX, which was an amendment to the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And Title IX basically means that schools and colleges that receive federal funding have to not give preferences to men. They have to actually offer equitably to all gender. So instead, they have to allocate their resources in proportion. So this means, if there's a men's basketball team, that there's a women's basketball team. And that, because before Title IX, like Condoleezza Rice talks about this in this documentary about how You had to have like a bake sale just to go to your away game. You had no funding, no support. And it was very difficult for women to be athletes in that kind of realm. So today, 42% of high school athletes and 44% of college athletes are female. So these things are changing largely as the result of Title IX. Another way the institutions can change is small acts of defiance. They do resist change, institutions, but they're not unchangeable. It's not always easy, but it's possible. And institutions never change unless people like you begin to question them and challenge them. So taking chances and bucking expectations may not lead anywhere in your lifetime, but it's like a snowball, right? It builds up steam as it rolls down that hill. So those little changes in policies, or just even the challenges that you put in your lifetime, could really help people a generation or two from now. You never know what small act of defiance will make history. But one thing is for sure, history is always going to get made. And so we're always going to, we're human beings, and these institutions are built around us and our ideologies. So as those ideologies change, so will the institutions. So when even a minority of people recognize that institutionalized practices are cultural rather than natural, this opens opportunities for themselves and for others who want to make change to try to coalesce and find a way to make that change happen.